So now that we've gotten some of the logistics out of the way, now we get to the fun stuff. Why should we study food in the first place? Well, you might have multiple kinds of reasons that you decided to take this course, and I'd be interested in hearing about those in your introductory post on D2L. But why should we study food as anthropologists? Well, to start out, all humans eat. Biologically, we have to eat in order to survive. Our bodies need the nutrients and the sustenance that food provides. But there's some other good reasons why we should study food. First of all, food involves all five senses. You can hear things sizzling on the grill, or you can hear the particular way vegetables sound as perhaps someone snaps the ends off of peas or green beans as they're fresh, or the sizzling of the fajitas there in the corner. All those different kinds of things. So you can hear, you can smell, you can taste, you can touch. And in some ways, you can't get away from the sensory or the cultural experience. So there are some kinds of things where you can shut your eyes and you won't be able to see the food, but you'd still be able to smell it. You can't really get away from a smell unless you travel to the other side of the state, for instance, sometimes. And there's also this cultural experience. There's no food that you can eat without sort of engaging with some kinds of cultural values. And this semester we're going to explore those cultural meanings in food. We will talk a little bit about nutrition, but primarily we're interested in the social meanings of food. And that gets us to why we should study food anthropologically. So all humans eat, and all animals eat, but what they eat, and how they eat, and with whom, and under what circumstances, if it's a holiday, if it's hard-won food that you hear your grandfather talk about how when he was your age he wasn't able to eat such wonderful things, or kids today, why do they want these kinds of fast food, all those sorts of things. All of that is eminently variable. So this is kind of interesting, how there's so many cultures all over the world, and they decide that certain foods are important to them and certain foods are not important, or maybe not even food. Why do some people eat bugs and other people think that that's gross? This is a kind of thing that is partly determined by environment and what's available, but also really determined by culture, and so we'll talk about that. And only humans create specific cultural and symbolic ties to the food that they fortify themselves with. And this is interesting. You don't see birds sitting around and deciding that, worms are better than bugs to eat because they have specific symbolic meanings. Those birds are just kind of hungry, we think. Maybe, there could be bird language things that we don't know what's going on. But for the most part, only humans create specific cultural symbolic meanings to what they fortify themselves with. And so in this way, physiological and biological processes also become social processes. So in this example, you've got these little Valentine's hearts that are actually inscribed with little messages. So those aren't just satisfying your carbohydrate urges. If somebody gives those to you when you're in 4th grade, you're probably not thinking about how many calories they have and whether that will allow you to, go hunt a deer more quickly. No, what you're probably thinking is, wow, I wonder if that person likes me. That right there is a good example of cultural values being inscribed, literally inscribed in this case, into a foodstuff. And what other reasons do we have to study food anthropologically? Well, there's quite a lot of them, and it's one of the interesting kinds of things that food is one of those key cultural items that show us how the world has been globalized for a very long time and has been a key driver in many historical events. If you think about Christopher Columbus, he was trying to go around the world trying to find a route to get spices, among other things, to make food taste better. There have been many continents, countries, nations, hard won and hard fought over because of food. Even the slave trade, which drastically impacted many different countries and many different cultures around the world, was very much in part done because of sugarcane and other kinds of foods that there needed to be more labor in certain parts of the world. And so these kinds of relationships between food and different groups of people and different amounts of power, basically, show us how food gets kind of tied up in these social relations. Food has also shaped and continues to shape national boundaries and identities. So we'll talk about a lot of the ways that food becomes symbolic of different national identities and becomes parts of national citizenship. If I say tea, who do you think about in the world? Probably the British, right? Potatoes are really tied together with Ireland and the Irish potato famine. But potatoes are actually a New World food. They originated in Central and South America. And this is pretty interesting because most people would probably think about the Irish when they think about potatoes. And so these are the kinds of ways that food ties together different cultures and is really interesting in thinking about history and culture. And especially when we consider the ways that food and foodways influence relations of power. So these are some really important things to consider that we can think about anthropologically. Now, investigations of food have always been a part of traditional anthropology. So back in the turn of the century, in the 20th century, so in the 1900s, even in the late 1800s, when some anthropologists or people that would, after a while, be considered anthropologists or sociologists, were doing anthropological studies, especially at the turn of the 20th century, people would go out and they would catalog cultures. And so they would go to a different place and they would try to write down all the things or document all of the kinds of things that people did, what their religion was like, what their clothing looked like, how they decided what to eat, and what they grew agriculturally. And so these kinds of things became part of traditional anthropology in order to understand those daily, everyday tasks that people do and how this creates a life for people in many different kinds of ways. This early work also investigated the layers of symbolism surrounding food. So we'll talk later in the semester about some of these more traditional anthropologists. We'll read some things from the beginnings of anthropology and talk about the way that food became part of a way to explore symbolic systems in different kinds of cultures. Now, food can also give us clues into the ways humans evolved and how culture emerged. When we think about the growth of agriculture or the ways that early humans used fire to cook or used other kinds of ways to soften foods and to make foods more palatable so that they could eat and get more nutrition, and how this eventually led to people living in bigger groups, and how this led to more complex societies, as the archaeologists like to say, or more kinds of complicated social relations. This is a great way of making sense of the links between food and culture. And something that's really interesting to me, too, is to think about the ways that the study of food and language can reveal many different kinds of things. So we can look at the words for different sorts of foods and see how they have traveled across vast distances. This has been done in the Pacific to show the links between Southeast Asia and many different islands across the Pacific. And it's also linked with genetic material and archaeological artifacts. It's one more line of evidence, of cultural evidence, to show how people have moved across the globe throughout history. And we can also use food and language studies to reveal how power relationships are embedded in everyday talk. If you think about religion, if you think about the ways that different people talk about different people who eat food and other kinds of food, then this might reveal how power relationships are embedded in everyday talk. We'll talk more about that later in the semester. Now, one of the interesting things to think about, too, is the way that food now plays a huge role in American popular culture. But Michael Pollan has actually pointed out, he is one of these main players in this popular culture food movement, that fewer people than ever actually spend time cooking. There's more people that are eating out and doing other things instead of cooking a home-cooked meal from scratch than ever before. So what's going on here? People are paying lots of money for really high-tech kitchen gadgets and kitchens themselves, and yet fewer and fewer people are actually spending very much time cooking. I wonder how much time you spend watching cooking shows rather than cooking in the kitchen. So this is an interesting kind of phenomenon to think about, and how culture plays a role in that. And joining in the consumption of food as leisure, so for instance going to fine restaurants or spending a long time cooking something very elaborate for friends, for instance, becomes part of the process of modernity and modernization in many industrializing countries. So this is another way we can study food anthropologically to find out this process of modernity and how food plays a role in this. And even the critique of these processes and the global food production system has become a part of mainstream culture. So this is where you get into like cultural meta-analysis. You're analyzing the analysis of culture. So people talking about how, everyone is buying these expensive kitchens and they're watching Iron Chef and they're obsessed with Julia Child, and talking about this and spending a lot of time talking about what people are talking about has become part of mainstream culture. And so that's also interesting.